Is there something uncomfortable buried in what you're saying? Like, could an extremely efficient healthcare organization actually be getting worse at caring for people? You've said this before. Are we optimizing the wrong thing? So I guess this would be like a similar question. But this is a little deeper. If by optimizing these things, are we actually getting worse at the thing that we're there to do?
100%. And that's exactly the uncomfortable part of this, the whole Goodhart's law. If you remember, we talked a lot about that. When a measure becomes a target, it stops being a good measure. When retention rate of your therapist is the measure, and you're buying it through compensation or through other means to affect the measure rather than what you're really aiming for, it no longer is a good measure. You can hit every KPI and hollow out the very visits that those KPIs were built on, right? Tighter blocks, scripted interactions, check out in 5 seconds. Congratulations, you've optimized every moment where trust could have been formed.
All right, healthcare is obsessed with optimization, scheduling, revenue cycle, productivity, AI. We measure everything we can put on a dashboard. And Larry thinks we may have missed one. Maybe it is the reason a lot of us went to school for this. What if the thing healthcare actually needs to optimize is humanness? I like that word. And what if that's not just the soft stuff? What if it's actually a business strategy? Ooh, businessizing humanness. So Larry, let's start here. You open this new series by essentially telling a room full of healthcare operators, business people, hey, you might be optimizing the wrong thing. What do you think we've gotten wrong?
Yeah, let me start with a little bit of background. So I presented at a national conference in Las Vegas about 4 months ago, I think it was. And these are to some very stout colleagues, CEOs, very large private equity-backed dental service organizations who I'm quite impressed with and have spent time collaborating with over the last couple of years. And so I started that out with essentially how I started this piece out, effectively with a confession. I've sat in these rooms, I've led all these rooms around this, and I love a good dashboard as much as any operator. But every conversation that I started having with folks, I would say over the past year in dental, but also in physical therapy and healthcare in general, went to the same 3 places. Optimizing our schedule, technology adoption, your tech stack, and then third, AI, which is all tech. All of that absolutely matters, but none of that is the answer. So if you think about it, for 30 years, we've treated operations as the variable and care as the constant, as if the human part would just persist on its own while we turned everything around it. And it didn't. And so while we were optimizing everything measurable, and this is what I've been repeating to my folks all the time, we neglect everything memorable. So we optimize a visit with a patient, but are we really impressing and connecting with the patient that will leave them with a positive impression and a memorable outcome? So the wrong thing isn't the spreadsheet, it's believing that the spreadsheet is the strategy. And if you really believe as an organization that your future lives in your tech stack, or your future lives in you being able to, vibe code AI, you're building a company, in our case, a dental company of the past, because no patient has ever referred a friend because the confirmation texts were punctual, right?
Correct.
Because they were efficient, because they were optimized. And what I think has been getting lost in this is the humanness side of it. And, James Nesbitt, many, many, many years ago said, anytime you have high tech, you need high touch. But we tend to get impressed with the shiny objects of high tech and unimpressed, because it's a soft, almost emotional thing, with high touch. And what I'm saying is we need to have better balance in how we look at it, and a better lens from how we evaluate optimization, tech, and AI.
All right. Well, then you use this phrase in your latest article on Substack, which sounds like it's in opposition, optimizing humanness? Like those two things feel like they're in opposition. That sounds almost intentionally contradictory. So how do you sort of square that circle? How do you explain optimizing humanness?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this because the contradiction really is the point, and after seeing, Odysseus movie of, last week, that's the Trojan horse, right?
Right.
Operators only would take it seriously if it sounds like a KPI. So I bolted optimizing on there, onto the one asset we've been ignoring. And what it actually means is take warmth, attention, human connection, the things we've been filing under soft skills, and give them the same rigor we give revenue cycle management. Train them deliberately, design the patient experience around them, measure what they're happening, positive psychology, empathetic communication, intentional relationship design, not as a do it as strategy, not as a poster in the break room or something, right? The science already calls things into the treatment modality. We have unbelievable good efficacy and good data on that. I'm just asking folks to run their human high touch side like they run their data side.
You point out that a huge number of people actively dread going to the dentist. I mean, it might be in some people's top 3 of things I would like to avoid. And then you write, well, our collective response has largely been better scheduling software. Like you mentioned a minute ago, people don't tell a friend about this experience because the text reminders were on time. So why does healthcare keep reaching for operational solutions to human problems?
Yeah, and if you think about physical therapy and dentistry, one thing we share together is physical therapy has often been called pain and torture, PT, right? And while we don't really account for the percentage of anxiety in PT, we there's lots of studies in dental. It could be as high as 70%.
Wow.
And so what I would say is that operational problems are the tools that we could see. A scheduling gap. You see that it shows up at a data point. It shows up in a report. A patient's anxiety doesn't, and so the operators fix what shows up.
Right.
What gets measured and managed, but what doesn't get measured sort of gets abandoned. And I'm a big believer in you get what you emphasize. And so if you start emphasizing humanness, you'll get it. But there's a comfort factor too. An ops fix is a purchase order, right? A human fix is sort of a mirror. Only one of those can be delegated. So you can end up with the irony in this piece, somewhere between 1 in 6 adults and more than half, depending entirely on how you measure it, are dreading your product in dentistry. Think about that. They have to be consumers of it. And we know that 40% of the American population doesn't even get any dentistry.
Wow.
And a good portion of those 40% is because they dread it, right? And so, the big response is optimizing. Send them a reminder text. Keep them, optimize all you can through technology. And yeah, some of those things are very, very helpful. But we've gotten world class at efficiency of scheduling people into an experience that they don't want to be at. That's not transformation. That's faster dread. And the no-show cancellation rates in dental exceed that of healthcare. And so why are we not trying to optimize the root cause, which in this case is dread, fear, anxiety, through better education on soft skills of human connections and empathetic communications and all of those kinds of things? It's easier to fix the techno side of it. That's my real main point, the lens of looking at all this.
Yeah. Well, you teed up my next question where I was going to go next. Like I can already hear the audience going, this is great. Like I believe this. This sounds warm. This sounds funny. Let's fun. Let's bring in humanness. They might be thinking this sounds great, but I got margins. Like I have staffing problems. I have production targets. So this might sound nice, but how would you make the business case for this? How would you arm the person listening going, I believe you, but how do I pitch this to my boss? So where does being more human actually show up in the numbers that my boss might let me beta test this?
Yeah. And let me take a minute or two to get there because it's a very fair pushback.
Yeah.
I mean, I run a platform. I've got investors. I'm an investor. I start at a high level where you have to fundamentally believe that part of your organization is a human capital talent management machine, as a value creator. And what I mean by that is just like you allocate dollars to buy dental scanners or operatories and PT equipment, you know, high-low tables, all those kind of things, right?
Right.
Exercise stuff. That's capital equipment. My mentality is I want to invest in human capital. And so I allocate dollars and resources towards that because that's where my priority is. That's where my value is. That's where I do believe our mission is at. But here is more the businessy case, you know, for some of the things that you're saying. And I'll use some psychology here. So Kahneman's peak end rule, the last 60 seconds of a visit disproportionately determines whether that patient comes back
Right.
and whether they refer friends and family to you. Return and referral aren't soft numbers, right? Those are patient retention numbers.
Right.
And your cheapest form of patient acquisition, what we say in Kentucky, milk our own cows first. And that really is what will get you a driving practice at a lower cost. You want to spend money in a leaky bucket of marketing leads, social media, digital, blah, 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 blah. Or if you do it in Humanness, you'll get better referrals and a better return. So Jane Dutton had this thing around high quality connections, brief, you know, positive interactions that leave sort of both people at a better place, more energized, more trusting. In dental, that manifests itself as case acceptance and team retention in a single finding. Case acceptance in dental and sometimes could be less than 50%. Well, if I can drive that number through better human connection from 50 to 75%, guess what goes up? My margin, my profitability, my cash flow. Now flip it. Anxiety drives avoidance. Avoidance drives attrition. And the most expensive line on your P&L is the one that isn't printed on it. The patient who quietly didn't rebook, who didn't come back in, the clinician who quit, who was the quiet quitter. Humanness is the alternative to your margins. It's the margin you haven't touched yet. And the CapEx is roughly zero in most companies. So you see, if I can take a measurement like treatment case acceptance, retention, and no-show cancellation and flip it from a metric that is a very hard metric to what can I do through human connectedness, empathy, peak end effect to drive it, you can make a strong business case for
it. Let's go the other route. Tell me about Maria in the article that you just wrote. What did she understand about one patient that had some anxiety that a perfectly optimized workflow might miss? It would never show up there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I do these amazing coins once a month that are based on nominations. And so many of them are these patient testimonials. So when I use a case like, you know, Maria, it's a real case. The names may be changed, but it's exactly, and sometimes people get there by just kind of a natural tendency towards this, or they're just, you know, they're just really, really good at it. And other times, my belief is you can train for it. So Maria's a dental assistant in one of our practice. An elderly patient comes in. They're very anxious. A lot of times people have shame in dentistry too. They're ashamed of their teeth. You know, you have that working, plus anxiety, and they both manifest itself. They haven't seen a dentist in years. You know, so the optimized workflow says, intake is running long, keep it moving, right? You know, but Maria pulled her chair up close, sat at an eye level and asked one question: how you doing? How you really doing? And that's the actual skill. It's the connection skill where both people are left better off. She didn't redirect. The patient talked about her husband's, you know, illnesses, her worries. Why'd she be putting off her own care? You know, but she left with a treatment plan and a commitment to return, all because of human connection. And here is what the Marias of the world understand that the workflow misses. The anxiety was the chief complaint, not their teeth. They didn't come. They have fair avoidance. We know this in physical therapy on patients that have back injuries, right? That's the condition. The dentistry is downstream of it. The physical therapy is downstream of that low back pain. A perfect workflow would have processed the intake right on schedule, and the patient wouldn't have come back with a commitment. So Maria wasn't running a referral program; she was revealing one.
Right.
Who does the patient tell? Her family, her friends, everyone that she loves. And so you have these downstream effects of humanness, and they are you can calculate them if you use the right metrics that are sometimes directly or indirect. It's also the relationship between qualitative and quantitative metrics. And these things are really palpable. And I think the difference maker in an environment where everybody has been so busy optimizing the mechanizing, commodity driven way we've looked at healthcare and dentistry.
You go on to argue that warmth, attention, connection aren't merely soft skills. And again, we should probably do a little marketing work on soft skills because it makes it sound like it's not as valuable. Right. But they're part of the treatment. If that's true, why don't we train and measure them with the same seriousness that we give clinical competency?
Yeah, we should. And honestly, we don't. Clinical competency, if you think about it, that gets your boards, your licensure, your CE requirements, your calibration. It's decades of sort of infrastructure. Connection gets one slide in orientation. Smile.
Right.
Good luck out there. Underneath that is bad assumption that warmth is a trait you hire for rather than a skill you build. And I like the statement, soft skills are the new hard skills. I love all the emphasis that people are placing on them, but unfortunately, I don't see a lot of companies delivering on it. The research says, by the way, what it says: empathetic communication is trainable, responding well to people is trainable. We just have never really built the curriculum because we file it under, personality. What we're doing at DCA, I turned it into Call to Care, into an actual provider course that we hold people accountable to, that's got modules, that has tests, that has practice, that has knowledge, checks, that it's a mentoring kind of thing as well. We give that the same seriousness we'd give any clinical program, so that we train dentists and we upskill them. They're getting upskilled not in hands in the mouth skills, but mouth skills outside of the mouth skills.
Right.
And measuring it isn't mysterious. Audit the last 60 seconds of the visits and you'll see whether that's trainable or not. Read what patients actually write in reviews, not what they punch on a 5-star system.
Correct.
Nobody has ever, come in and said, boy, that intraoral scanner that you've got, these wellness checks, now that is amazing. What they do, though, is they name people. And that's what you see in reviews. And so if we're naming people in all of these qualitative checks, why aren't we training people to do the same?
I had a really simple exercise I suggested. You've got data out there hiding in plain sight. I suggested that business owners go to their Google reviews, copy all, run it through your favorite AI, and just ask, what are the patterns? And what I've seen with a couple just doing this superficially, front office staff or clinical staff that get mentioned over and over, that's a signal that your audience is telling you something. So something you just mentioned there. Is there something uncomfortable buried in what you're saying? Like, could an extremely efficient healthcare organization actually be getting worse at caring for people? You've said this before. Are we optimizing the wrong thing? So I guess this would be like a similar question. But this is a little deeper. If by optimizing these things, are we actually getting worse at the thing that we're there to do?
100%. And that's exactly the uncomfortable part of this, the whole Goodhart's law. If you remember, we talked a lot about that. When a measure becomes a target, it stops being a good measure. When retention rate of your therapist is the measure, and you're buying it through compensation or through other means to affect the measure rather than what you're really aiming for, it no longer is a good measure. You can hit every KPI and hollow out the very visits that those KPIs were built on, right? Tighter blocks, scripted interactions, check out in 5 seconds. Congratulations, you've optimized every moment where trust could have been formed.
Mm-hmm.
You've limited the human connection and time. Every dashboard is green, but the patients leave and they're unattached. They have not built emotional connection with your clinic. And how do you know that? Look what the dashboards don't show. Patients don't cancel, they just never rebook. Treatment case acceptance in dental goes down. Most groups don't run that report. One of the interesting things about dental that's very different than PT, in physical therapy, the first visit is usually the most lucrative because you got the initial evaluation, that's a higher charge. In dental, the second visit is the most lucrative because that's typically when they accept or start their treatment case acceptance. Very different. But in physical therapy, if you remember, we had a lot of conversations about this. I'm getting ready to do a talk in Nashville at one of these private practice summits coming up. I think it's in September. And I've got some really interesting data that you and I have chatted about called the cliff. They don't even realize that their drop off is occurring between patients 2 and 3. Significant numbers don't come back between visits 2 and 3, that retention. And most practices aren't even measuring that. And that's a humanness kind of proxy, right? They're failed to make the real connection to the physical therapist. So in dental, there's a lot of overlap through this. What do the exit interviews say on a patient? There's a walk the floor test that, standing in your practice the last 60 minutes and look, this 3-visit test I use in PT. That's the data point I want to know in due diligence. How many of your patients are leaving at that time? And most patients in PT, as you well know, don't even complete their treatment care plan. But you have to have a caring audit. No dashboard at all covers it.
Yep. You take this from the floor, the treatment room, and up the ladder into leadership. If we're so serious about optimizing humanness, again, love that phrase, that needs to be on a t-shirt somewhere. Does that mean we've also been promoting and selecting the wrong kinds of leaders?
Yeah, I'll say it pretty clearly. We've been hiring resumes and hoping for leaders. Pedigree tells someone can do the right thing. That's part of this whole Peter Drucker thing about efficiency, but it tells you nothing about whether a scared new assistant will speak up in the operatory, at least in dental.
Right.
There's that whole Amy Edmondson psychological safety. And it's one of the strongest predictors of team performance we have. The Google researchers did all that a few years back. The profile of the future really is emotional intelligence, resilience, adaptability, the ability to build safety in your clinical team, not instead of competence. Competence is table stakes, right? We assume people have good clinical skills, but the tiebreaker amongst competent people, which is where every hiring decision actually lives. I remember a long time ago, the John Maxwell leadership book, where he called it the law of the lid. Basically, the concept is a team never outgrows its leader. Every practice culture I've walked into that is the shadow of the leader, right? And so, yes, different profile, hire people who can lift lids, who can take you to the next level. And that involves a little bit of normalizing discomfort, taking you where places that you need to go, but you won't go there on their own.
Yeah. Here's one of the lines that felt like sort of the thesis or the through line of the whole article. We need to stop optimizing the humanness away, almost like it's something to get rid of. So where do you see organizations accidentally doing that today? And maybe a key or two on how we can stop doing that.
Everywhere. And it's always with the best of intentions. Good. And that's what makes it, invisible, right? Each sort of cut is defensible on its own, but collectively, they remove every moment where a connection could occur. You get to an end of the visit, you hand a piece of paperwork to somebody and go to a payment terminal. Daniel Kahneman again says that's the most valuable clinical minute of the appointment, and we give it to a card reader, a scheduler. Schedule the minute of the appointment, and there's no slack for a Maria moment. Her conversation doesn't fit a 10-minute intake block, so the block wins. Scripts that are so rigid, they turn a warm human being into a phone tree with legs. A dental hygienist measured purely on chair time units or production, not return of patients scheduled within the next 6 months. That's just a KPI. And the newest one that I hear about is AI answering the phone for an anxious patient who took 3 weeks to take the nervousness up to even make a call to a dentist to begin with. Yep. Not one of those decisions is done, but nobody's watching for the sum parts of that. The sum is the practice where, everything is optimized and no one is cared for.
All right. So here's the operational question I'll ask. If I gave you control of a 70 clinic healthcare platform tomorrow and said, optimize humanness, you are the humanness czar, what's the first thing you'd actually do on Monday morning? How do you begin that process?
Well, Jimmy, my first reaction is, a few hundreds, 70, Monday, that sounds like a vacation. What I actually do, I run about 400 of them, and notice that none of it requires a committee, a consultant, or $1 of pure CapEx. But, no culture initiative, no logo, no launch event. The moment culture gets a logo, it's already sort of on the shelf. So I think about it as a design, roughly 3 moves. You redesign the last 60 seconds of every visit, and you measure that and monitor it. Make sure that's memorable. The end belongs to a human, not a payment terminal, right? That's the Kahneman minute. That's the cheapest clinical intervention in healthcare, is the peak end effect, how you end it. The second thing is you find your Marias. Every clinic has one or two. They're the names patients write in reviews. Study them. I call it positive deviancy. Take those who are the most positive deviants, learn about them, celebrate them, highlight them. They are your exemplars. Make them the curriculum, right? And then I think the third thing you do is you got to change the hiring interview a bit. You got to look at and measure accessibility, adaptability, emotional intelligence. What do they understand about psychological safety? For every, look at it in terms of for every hour on their resume, right? The measure, we tend to measure the boring lag numbers, rebooking, reactivation, turnover, but be the patient. Culture compounds, and nothing compounds faster than culture. But you have to combine the rigor and the discipline of metrics and KPI to humanness and culture. And so in our organization, it manifests itself with our mission vision that we not just put on a tagline, but we build into their job description, and they're measured and they're valued by it. It's based on our amazing customer service system. It's made about our call to care, which is system means it's defined, it's taught, it's monitored, it's rewarded, it's re-engineered. You get in business what you emphasize. It's emphasized constantly. And then we look at how it has impacted the results: treatment case acceptance, no-show cancellation rates, retention rates of dentists, how long the dentists are staying in your organization, and where they become clinically autonomous, master, purposeful clinicians, but also good leaders and good managers and good operators, if that's where life takes them. So you can make these changes in company. There's a great Eric Reese book that just came out, I think, in May this year, Jimmy, that would be, he'd be a great, he's the one who wrote The Lean Startup, and he wrote another book called Incorruptible, and it's about how great companies go bad. And not surprisingly, when you look at many of them, Whole Foods, Price Warehouse, he goes through a whole litany of them. They dropped the cultural elements.
Yep.
They sold out the cultural elements. And we learn these lessons over and over again, and yet we never really learn.
Who knew that history was actually a really important class? It wasn't just fun stories.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Curveball question then. If connection drives retention and referrals, should clinicians actually be compensated for being great at it? You're saying change the hiring sort of rubric and bring people in who are better at these soft skills. So if we know that leads to retention and referrals, would it be good to compensate clinicians for being great at it?
Yeah, 100%. It's pretty straightforward in dentistry. They are rewarded for it because they get a percentage of what they collect. And so it's, what's their best business move to supply a lot of, dish out a lot of coffee to a lot of patients? Well, you do that over time, you're not going to have many patients wanting coffee. But if you are kind and courteous to your patients, you drive good empathy and good human connection to them, they're the ones that drive more referrals to you. So this isn't just a good for life, good for emotion. It's good for business, and it drives the training on their competency, upskills them. So now they're doing bridges rather than teeth cleanings, or they're pulling teeth, or they're doing restorative work, or they're doing orthodontia. And they're also having patients who've had good human connection with, referring more patients to them, friends and family. So they go together. And you could look at what is, if you look in the last 15 years in dentistry, they've actually taken us, like physical therapy, cost for inflation, their salaries have been reduced. But you can reverse that. And the way you reduce it is upskilling in both clinical skills and human compassion, empathy, skills as well.
Yep.
And guess what? You also have providers who are less burned out.
Who knew? Oh, Larry, you knew.
Yeah.
So maybe healthcare doesn't need another optimization strategy. Maybe we need to look at what 30 years of optimization is actually removed. What have we optimized and scrubbed away? Because it looks like the company of the future might not win by becoming less human. It might win by finally realizing humanness, again, love that term, was an operating advantage all along. Now, this is part one of Larry's new 5-part series, Inside a Platform. Make sure to subscribe to The Operator on Substack so you don't miss part 2 and the rest of the series. Until next time, keep operating.